Hi, Rob.
Hi, Nancy. How you doing?
Great. How are you doing?
Doing pretty well, thank you.
I'm pretty excited to be doing this with you. I don't think we've ever actually presented together, and I think that like our content is like just so complementary, so I'm really excited.
Likewise, I appreciate the opportunity to play around with you a little bit. I hope this is the first of several opportunities.
Definitely. I'm game for anything with you.
Okay. All right. Well, we've talked about a couple of things, and I appreciated you reaching out about the state scan work. I think that helps bring additional people into the conversation. So
Yeah, absolutely. And you all will be just so helpful because you honestly you're more connected to the state's work on this anyway. So I want to make sure that like as we design the rubrics for what to scan, we're actually reflective of like giving them the right scores. So
sure. Well, it's not easy to do, but it's really worth the effort to really figure it out. So, again, appreciate it. Very thoughtful of you.
So I will share my screen first. Oh, you know what? I think I forgot to do something. There we go. Hi, Jonathan. Rob, Jonathan is our new senior research associate. He just came to us from California. I now have like a full research team again. I'm really excited about it.
Fantastic. Jonathan, glad to meet you virtually. Look forward to figuring out how we might get to know each other a little better. Nancy and I are up to a couple of things, so I assume that we'll be talking on an ongoing basis. Do we know how many people we're expecting?
I honestly do not know. Allison said that she's expecting quite a few to join us.
Sure.
But we'll find out, I guess.
Sure. And look, just cue me or whatever you need for me to do. Also, tell me to be quiet if you need if you need to. Well, I mean, this is just a good opportunity to do some things, and the time is limited, so it's your show. So,
well, I'd like to think of this as our show.
no, understood, but I understand, and much appreciated. But you invited me, and so I'm here to be a good partner. I guess that's the point.
Okay.
So we want to make sure that we're able together to deliver what it is you think you had in mind when you put this together.
Got it. Yes. Well, pretty much anything that comes out of your mouth will end up being what is right for this anyway.
You're kind. You're very kind. Thank you.
Hi, Penny. So Penny, I see you trying to share your video and audio. And for now, we're just going to keep it with the speakers. But when we get to the point of questions, I'll be happy to put you on video and audio. Okay? Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll get started in just about 30 seconds just to see if anybody else wants to join. Okay, I think we can get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nancy Duchesneau. I am a senior P-12 research associate with the Education Trust's National Office in DC. And with me today is Dr. Robert Yeagers, who is the Vice President of Research at the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And we're really excited to have him here because he's great on equity and social emotional learning. So I'd like for you all to take a moment and think for a second about what made you excited to go to school when you were in middle school, elementary school, high school. Maybe it was a really great teacher that really inspired or challenged you. Maybe it was just wanting to see your friends at school, or maybe something else. Or conversely, maybe you remember something that made you not want to go to school. Maybe it was experiencing discrimination or being bullied. So I'd like you to just take a moment and reflect. And then if you're willing to share, could you type it in the chat and just share with us either what made you excited to go to school or what made you not want to go to school. I loved learning new things. Thank you very much, Mary. Couldn't wait to see your friends and teachers. Thank you. Always felt energized in elementary school to have people to talk to. Enjoyed learning and extracurricular activities. Love for learning. Great. These are really great answers. Thanks to everybody. And so I'd like for you all to kind of hold on to these experiences throughout this workshop, throughout this session, because they show how your engagement in school is social and emotional. And so it's critical for schools to create environments that support students socially and emotionally. Oh, I just saw one, breakfast and lunch free or reduced. That actually was one of the things that I looked forward to in high school, being able to go into school and have lunch because I didn't often have food in the house. So school is definitely more than just academics, right? We can see that it's clearly social and emotional. And so today, I'm first gonna give a brief presentation on a report that we recently released on social, emotional, and academic development through an equity lens. And then Dr. Yeagers is gonna talk a little bit about transformative social and emotional learning. And we'll have a brief conversation about putting it together in the current context around the dual pandemics of COVID as well as racism. And then we'll leave some time for you all to ask some questions as well. So I'd like for you all to imagine Grace, a Black girl on the first day of her senior year of high school. And I want you to imagine 3 moments of her day. The first moment is her getting ready for school. And it's a bit of a hectic morning because her mom has just gone through chemo, and so she's helping her younger brother get ready for school. Unfortunately, the morning runs a little late. She's running into her high school and she runs into her homeroom class, and unfortunately she walks in about 2 seconds after the bell. But her school has a zero tolerance policy for tardiness, and her homeroom teacher says she has to go to the office. Grace, understandably frustrated, walks away, and her teacher just thinks, Grace needs to learn some self-management. Now, the second moment in the day I want you to think about is her walking into her AP history class. She walks in and she notices right away that she's the only Black girl there. And her teacher says, this is AP history. Do you belong in this class? Understandably upset at this microaggression, Grace says yes, a little bit tersely, sits down. She reminds herself that she's going to ace this class. And her teacher says, you don't have to get an attitude about it. Now, the third moment, later that day, Grace participates in a social emotional learning program that's run by her homeroom teacher, who starts off the discussion kind of pointedly talking at Grace about how important it is for students to control their emotions and make responsible decisions. I think it would be fair if this were Grace's reaction. Often, when we hear about social emotional learning, what they're talking about is learning competencies or skills like these. We want students to learn to manage their emotions and behavior, to make responsible decisions, to believe in their ability to achieve. Yes, absolutely. And because those skills are valuable, more than 90% of schools and districts say they're working to support the social emotional learning of their students. And while they're almost always well-intentioned, too often the approaches used are about identifying a skill or competence that kids allegedly don't have or don't have enough of, and so are based in building these skills without clear attention to the learning environments that influence social emotional development. But as you could see from Grace's experience, social emotional learning programs that focus on teaching these skills aren't the whole picture we need to look at. It's not fair to be telling students of color to control their anger without also confronting the systemic racism that is understandably anger-inducing. And this is worrisome because, as Grace's story shows, context matters. Societal realities like the racism that Grace experienced, individual realities like the responsibilities Grace had outside of school, and cultural background all influence social emotional development and whether an adult views a student as competent in social emotional skills. Another example that I give from my own experience is that I grew up in a Korean household where I was taught that respect is shown to adults not by looking them in the eye and engaging them in conversation as though we're equals, but by looking down, quietly agreeing. Yet in my school, my white teachers often thought that I was too shy, didn't know how to build relationships, because I didn't conform to their expected norms. But instead, it would have been much more helpful if my teachers had built relationships with me and my family to really understand our cultural backgrounds and our norms. And so when schools use approaches that don't use an explicit equity lens, that don't acknowledge the role of students' racial and cultural experiences in social emotional development, approaches that fail to address the processes and the structures in schools that systematically disadvantage students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, and immigrant youth, or treat social emotional learning as separate from academics, then we see something like Grace's experience play out, where students are told they're not meeting social and emotional norms and standards when they're actually excelling at those social and emotional skills. And that could actually do more harm than good. So with these concerns in mind, we spoke with students and families of color across the country in a qualitative study to understand their experiences and what schools should be doing to support social, emotional, and academic development for students of color. And we learned that they're worried too. Many students of color already have and are expected by society to learn advanced social and emotional skills because of the context of race. Consider, for example, Grace's control of her emotions when her AP teacher asked if she belonged in an AP class, or her continued belief in her ability to achieve in that class. And yet, they're not recognized for that social and emotional competence often. And that's usually because there's a gap between schools and their communities and a misunderstanding of students' experiences. And what's more, our participants credited racial, ethnic, and cultural identity development as the core of social, emotional, and academic development, but noted that this is too often missing from conversations around social and emotional learning. So often, Our participants expressed that they didn't trust schools to explicitly teach these skills without first addressing the systemic racism and adult bias in schools. And I have one quote here from a really wonderful student that I spoke with.
The way schools are structured right now, the way education is structured, is not set up for students to succeed in those environments. Not to say students don't succeed, but not all students do. Some students make it out but aren't ready for the world after high school or even after middle school. So it's like you're not always set up to succeed based on how schools are structured.
So this requires us to shift our focus. Currently, we see a disproportionate focus on trying to fix kids by teaching them social emotional skills, to one where we broaden our focus, the context and the learning environments in which students are developing. Specifically, this means addressing adult beliefs and mindsets and the systems and structures to create positive and equitable learning environments. And we know that adult biases and beliefs about students, their beliefs in their own ability to make a difference and the skills they have, impact their behavior, such as what they choose to teach, how they choose to teach it, and how they interact with the students. And that in turn impacts student mindsets, beliefs, and skills. And beyond just educators, I want to note that these mindsets are critical for all adults working with children and youth. And so what are the mindset shifts we need? Well, specifically, adults must recognize the assets that students bring to the classroom and have high expectations for students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. And adults must continuously interrogate their biases. And not only must these biases be addressed, but we have to shift mindsets to an active orientation towards dismantling oppression. And third, adults also have to recognize and value the differences in students and accept what works for one student may not necessarily work for all students. And secondly, we need to address the policies and practices used in schools. And that doesn't necessarily mean creating new policies or practices, but looking at what's currently in place and asking ourselves, are we fostering student belonging? Are we challenging all students to thrive? And are we providing students the academic and holistic supports they need to thrive? And the thing is, we already know these things matter. We know they're important indicators of a positive school climate and that they lead to social emotional learning and academic engagement. But this is less often the narrative when folks talk about social emotional and learning in schools that have a majority of students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. And instead, when talking about those students, we often hear about managing emotions and behavior. And that can just turn into another form of policing. So in terms of specific policy and practice recommendations, one of the top recommendations is to provide meaningful professional development and supports. And you could see this as one of the main levers for addressing the adult bias, as well as their specific skills in the classroom. Secondly, schools really need to engage students, families, and communities as full partners, partly because we know that schools can't do everything on their own. And so making sure that you're engaging students, families, and communities means that you have more resources and more opportunities to really holistically support students, but also because those students, families, and communities know themselves best and know their cultures best.
I think it starts with your parents and who you're around, and if your parents give you that good environment of being able to deal with self-awareness and then teaching you how to interact with others so that you can be successful. Then also, like in school, it's like it's really important, and in schools it's a little different because you're taught to socialize differently in school than you are in the real world, which I think is part of the problem, quote unquote. Yeah.
So I'd like for you to note that last part of that quote where the student recognized that sometimes there's a mismatch between what schools are expecting in terms of socializing and what their home lives are expecting. And so that bridge between schools and their communities really is critical. Third, we really need to diversify the educator workforce, because whether or not students of color see teachers of color or leaders of color in their schools really influences how they see themselves, whether or not they feel like they belong in their schools, and how they envision their futures. Fourth, we need to ensure equitable access to and supports for success in rigorous and culturally sustaining coursework. And part of this means equitable access to advanced courses like AP and IB, but it also means having rigorous coursework regardless of what track you're on. And I have two quotes from students. I couldn't decide on which one. I think they're both fantastic. I think you'll like them.
Like, I was always satisfied with where I was, but I never really had like this sense of belonging that came from the school. And like, I don't know, I guess I think being a Black girl had a little bit to do with that, especially because I took 2 AP classes my senior year, and in both of those classes I was the only Black person. Yeah. And I think that's happened like throughout my entire high school career. Like, if you like, there was one Black student union meeting where they said like, how many of you guys have like a bunch of classes where you're the only Black student in the class, and pretty much everyone in the room raised their hand.
And secondly, focusing on the culturally sustaining piece of this.
I think that we should talk about other people other than just Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. Because like, I've been learning about that since I was like in first grade. Like I had to read myself about people like Malcolm X and things like that. Like, why can't we talk about other people? Because we've been reviewing the same information for the past 8 years.
And so I'd like to note that by culturally sustaining, we don't mean having just a couple lessons of the same material from year to year in Black History Month. We really mean integrating culturally sustaining coursework into all of the curriculum throughout the school year, whether it's history, literature, and math and science. Additionally, we really need to provide access to integrated wraparound supports and services, because we know that whether or not a student has all of their basic needs met influences how they develop socially, emotionally, as well as academically.
And if we don't address that well-being aspect, then there's no way we can like sort of progress ourselves if we don't have like maybe administration, maybe it's like a school group that we need or something like that.
And lastly, we really need to co-develop inclusive discipline and dress code policies with students and families. There's actually a really great session on discipline tomorrow if you're interested in learning a deeper dive on how to create safer learning environments for specifically Black girls. Whether or not an educator resorts to exclusionary discipline versus restorative discipline, where educators are having conversations with students about what happened, why it happened, and how to maintain relationships is really critical.
And first, it should be safe. The school should be a safe zone for a kid to be able to come and really be themselves. And sometimes that isn't the case. So you already have an area where the kid is already afraid.
So thank you all very much for indulging me as I talk about our reports. I will now turn it over to Dr. Yeagers to talk about transformative social and emotional learning.
Sure. Thank you very much, Nancy. And again, thanks for inviting me to be your partner in this workshop. And I'll try to be brief. There's, as you and I have talked a number of times, there's significant overlap in the work that we're engaged in and pushing forward on, and emerging collaborations as well across a number of projects. So I'll try not to play off what you've offered and not be redundant. Part of the beauty of it, however, is that our work at Castle started from a slightly different place, although we ended up, like you, with a focus on student experience, et cetera, and hopefully we'll get to that. When I joined Castle a couple of years ago, it was clear that there was an organizational commitment to better understand issues of equity, adult social and emotional learning, and the integration of academic, social, and emotional development. Castle had been involved in the National Commission on Academic, Social, and Emotional Development. I was part of the research group and helped write the the report on research for the next generation. And so I had a kind of a running start. So I've been at Castle 2 years now. Our strategic plan had equity, adult SEL, and integration of academic and social emotional instruction. So one of the first things that I was engaged in is really a landscape scan to look at the existing literature that was growing by leaps and bounds and try to figure out how to help Castle and thereby the field better understand the various ways in which social, emotional, and academic development were actually being studied, understood, and promoted in the field to be more inclusive with a particular focus on those focal issues. So one of the things that we did is ground the work in the existing Castle framework, which has as a long-term outcome engaged citizenship. So given the emphasis on equity and realizing that if you're focused on equity, that you must be acknowledging inequities exist, engaged citizenship seemed like a good organizing concept to begin thinking about it. And so it also implied that social and emotional learning could be understood as part of a civic socialization process, meaning that by definition, what social and emotional learning was attempting to do was to help young people and adults learn how to get along with one another. It acknowledged that learning and development are relational processes that occur in social contexts of various sorts. So long story short, we grounded the work in citizenship, but also with an understanding that the equity issue really implicated critical democracy. How do citizens become informed and engaged in co-constructing a democracy that we have not quite yet achieved? And so in many respects, this is legacy work when you begin thinking about the ways in which diverse groups of people have found their way to being more engaged in civil society in the US and across the globe. We landed on the notion of forms of social and emotional learning. When you looked at the literature, you could see that different groups of practitioners and researchers were emphasizing different aspects of core competencies or different core competencies. Castle's framework has 5 core competency buckets: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, responsible decision-making, and relationship skills. And so if you look across those buckets of competence development, you could see that depending on how people were positioned or young people were positioned, the emphases within those buckets differed. And so one way to get at that was to talk about a bucket of work and approach to social and emotional learning that really did not acknowledge the broader context of human development, meaning really be a good citizen, treat each other nicely, and that is the extent to which we are concerned about social emotional learning. That's the context. Versus transformative SEL, which we put forward as a way of thinking about issues of equity and excellence. In that form of social emotional learning, people were paying a lot more attention to critical self-awareness, critical social awareness, relational to address implicit bias, discrimination, bullying as interactional contexts that needed to be critiqued and reconciled and reformed in ways that got rid of those kinds of inequities actually occurring. So, in the context of doing this work, we landed on notions of identity, agency, and belonging as really being critical features of social emotional development, both for young people as well as adults. Identity meaning having to do with both your understanding of who you are, but also how you understand other people to view you. Agency having to do with self-management, but also self-expression and being agentic in spaces, and issues of belonging really having to do with both self-awareness as well as relational skills, meaning not only does one perceive whether or not they experience belonging when they enter into a social setting, but you can also construct social settings in which people share a sense of belonging. And so, this is the kind of work that we had been engaged in to refresh and revise our framework as well as our tools and resources. CASEL has been at this work since 1994, and we periodically go through a process where we do this kind of revision. So this is not, a unique kind of circumstance. It is timely and important, but not unique. And then pivoting towards some of the other points that Nancy was making. So, these are developmental outcomes or imperatives that we found to be important, but then also each of the contexts that Nancy walked through, the classroom, the school, the family, the community, the broader society are all contexts in which young people and adults learn about themselves and about one another through their interaction in spaces. So there's all these learning environments that, in order to develop a healthy sense of identity, certain types of interactions have to occur. To have a healthy sense of belonging, the environments need to offer up certain features. And so key features for us, while CASEL has historically done reviews of social emotional learning curriculum of various sorts in terms of the evidence that those programs have, we also pay attention to the school environment more broadly, and increasingly families and communities as contexts in which social emotional learning occurs. And so across those various contexts, we suggest that there are some core features like power sharing and like grounding learning in the lived experiences of the young people and the adults, and the scaffolding of that information so that academic materials are increasingly applied to the assets and the challenges that young people and adults find in their local settings. And through that process, then issues of identity, agency, and belonging emerge as kind of leading indicators of success, followed by other indicators that schools often compile, like attendance, like academic scores and grades and things of that nature. But it also allows for kind of deeper learning that occurs when you allow young people or position young people to be constructors of knowledge. If we assume that young people are experts on their own lived experience, then engaging them in a process whereby they lead or drive the work. For example, Nancy mentioned culturally sustaining pedagogy. A key feature of that is critical consciousness of raising, and the relational nature of the student teachers and the student to the teacher, et cetera. We put forward approaches like project-based learning, youth participatory action research, all of which are focused on young people's lived experience and the application of academic content to help young people better understand how the academic content helps them address the concerns or the challenges, the barriers, the facilitators to healthy growth, both individual as well as collective. I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was fantastic. I really appreciate your framing of it having to be around belonging, agency, and identity. And I think those all intertwine with each other, right? You can't really feel like you belong if you can't feel like you can stand up and voice yourself and be heard and valued by what you have to say. And you can't really feel like you belong if you feel like your identity has to be left at the door. So,
I would just emphasize the importance of identity is really the pivotal consideration. It is something who you are, right? Understanding that is kind of like the age-old human question, philosophy, social science, etc. And so it's terribly important. There was a recent report, The Promise of Adolescence, I think it's the National Academy of Education, National Academy of Sciences, where they realize that identity is such a pivotal developmental task that to not feature it is to misunderstand what human beings are actually, because it's about both being and becoming, right? And in the literature, it is both protective and promotive, right? If a healthy sense of identity buffers you against negative input from the environment, other people, et cetera. So bullying, discrimination, et cetera, you're buffered against that if you know who you are. If you don't, become susceptible, vulnerable, et cetera.
Right. Yeah. So I also really appreciated how you bring like the social emotional learning and couch it in some specific practices that enhance academics as well, like youth participatory research. And so I think it's really helpful for our advocates to understand, like specifically in the classroom, when we're thinking about culturally sustaining pedagogy or culturally relevant pedagogy, it doesn't just mean like an educator that like is bringing in a little bit of curriculum that is representative. It's really their way of teaching, as well as really giving opportunities to students to really investigate and dig into their backgrounds and their experiences in their academics. And speaking of their experiences, I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit to thinking about their experiences with COVID-19 and the rise in awareness for racial injustice. And I wanted to ask, like, what are some of the equity concerns you have in mind regarding social emotional learning and development of children and youth during this time?
Sure. Well, thanks for that. I mean, I think it is the pivotal question for us. Clearly, there are dual pandemics, right? So the health issue as well as state violence against unarmed African-American folks and increasingly other members of the populace, in a lot of ways just exacerbate pre-existing inequities. And so the rich get richer and the poor get poorer in this context. So I think some recent studies would show us that, upwards of 30% of some young people are completely disengaged from school at this point. That might be above and beyond, the technical difficulties, right? Having the technology to actually be on Zoom calls, et cetera. And so that manifestation of the kind of inequities that we have to address, and certainly places where relationships were stronger have fared better than places where relationships didn't exist or were tenuous. So there's the immediacy of that, but then there's what do we do as we evolve out of this? We don't know about, when the social distancing or when remote learning will no longer be part of what it is we're doing, when we'll have face-to-face. So how do we cultivate, establish, sustain, strengthen relationships during physical distancing, not social distancing, but physical distancing from one another? How do we, ensure that the various forms of stress and trauma that young people as well as adults have experienced, meaning, food insecurity, housing insecurity, loss of loved ones, et cetera, how do we address those issues as we begin to kind of come back together? It is the fall and schools have various models for how they're re-engaging, but all of these issues across social economic background, right? Everyone has been touched in one form or the other by COVID, and one form or the other by the ongoing civil unrest associated with state violence, as well as, you know, the things that are going on around our elections, et cetera, that induce another layer of stress and anxiety for the, you know, for the entire population. So, you know, working through those issues and building in a way that allow us to be different together and be more supportive, grounded in relationships, grounded in respect, and grounded in providing the kind of meaningful educational experiences that then allow young people to realize their fullest potential. I mean, those are persistent questions that predated the pandemic, but are exacerbated by the fact that we have to go through a pandemic. And then the, you know, the economics associated with this is, I think, is the other shoe that will eventually drop. You know, with educators put in peril, families put in peril, et cetera, and that, you know, the implications for young people. So pulling together and the collective work that we have to do together, you know, I think is what concerns me most, and also gives me the most hope.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I wonder, as you talk about the exacerbated inequities, one of the things that I've been thinking about is the exacerbated deficit framing that has occurred.
Right.
And I worry about it sometimes when I see pretty much every single news article is saying that students are traumatized and students are now unable to learn, or like have like developmentally slowed because of this. And I always like think to myself, well, hold on. Yes, we know for sure that like things have gotten bad for many, many students. But at the same time, we have to really respect the fact that so many students have like stepped up in their communities, stepped up in their families in really incredible ways. I think that critical consciousness you talk about for democracy has risen in students over the past year. And that's something that, while we have to definitely recognize that like the inequities have been exacerbated, we also have to recognize that like their strengths in some places, in some ways, have really grown as well. And I worry about educators who don't see that and maybe think about their students as unable to learn or are struggling with that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please, you.
Well, I was actually just going to shift to the next question, but if you have a response, please go ahead.
Well, no, I think your concerns are well placed. And when we talk about, you know, part of the reason for talking about, you know, identity, agency, and belonging as developmental phenomena that implicate adults as well, is that issue of critical consciousness, right? The consciousness of educators around these issues is important as well, because it's not that, well, there's a particular type of learning that may have not been occurring, right? So the thing that typically goes on in school would not be occurring because there is no school. However, there is learning going on. Young people and adults are learning how to navigate the current situation, and that too is part of what could be leveraged. In fact, what would be a better topic to explore than, you know, the origins of viruses, for example, or, you know, studying how communities have responded to the challenges and leveraged it to surface collective resources and use those collective resources to push forward. I think that's an excellent way to engage young people. They have to be curious about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if anybody in our audience has a question. You're welcome to put it in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, that's fine too. I just want to make sure that you all have an opportunity to ask us anything you'd like to. I'll do my wait time. Penny.
Can answer this. We now have this phrase, we talk about the belief gap, right? And that belief gap manifests itself in the classroom where you have a teacher who decides, you know what, the kid comes in ready to learn, is excited. I know what I can do. But then you have this teacher who's like, well, maybe this is, just like the girl who goes to the AP class, right? Are you supposed to be in here? So how do we talk about the belief gap and how that translates into deficit thinking, right? So what can we do to get these teachers to not and ignore that belief gap altogether, especially when we're talking about boys of color between 3rd and 5th grade, and then our girls in middle school?
Yeah, it's difficult. Your question is in that. So there's the belief gap, and then there's the gap between belief and practice, right? Because often, even if you can get people to shake them out of their deficit views, getting them to enact practices that celebrate youth knowledge, youth voice, youth as co-learners, I think is also a challenge. But the belief gap, we've tried to look at various forms of professional development. But some of the practices that we've talked about, this idea of project-based learning, participatory action research, and culturally responsive education, I think some of the approaches and practices allow you to be shaken loose from some of your working assumptions about young people and position young people as co-learners from the beginning, like co-constructors of knowledge. And when you, as an educator, the hope is once you see that, then it pricks your consciousness about the things that you can and should be doing and the potential of the young people. Because in the absence of some opportunity to observe them differently, shifting your mindset is more difficult, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to point out something that I heard from an SEL coordinator in Oakland Unified, who actually Castle set me up with for the call. But he said that like a lot of the work that they're doing is around making sure that adults in the system have opportunity to really reflect and interrogate what they're doing with each other. And I think that space is really critical in order to think about like, what do I believe? What are my biases? How does that impact my practices and what I choose to do in the classroom? And how can I change that? And I think having the space to do that is really important, as well as like making sure that there's clear professional development around it. Does anybody else have any questions that they would like to ask? Okay, well, I think we're technically out of time. But if anybody has any questions you'd like to follow up on, you're welcome to reach out to me at, I'll put my email address in the chat. Well, I don't want to volunteer Rob, but
Sure. Now we're partners in this, so there are ways that I can be helpful. Nancy, as you know, I'm always happy to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope all of you learned something, and please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Rob.